The United States was founded in 1776, but at least 24 of its 50 state names come from the languages of indigenous peoples who had been living across the continent long before the country even existed. Mississippi was originally the name of a river. Alabama came from the name of a people. Texas has roots in the Caddo language, then changed as the word passed through Spanish and English speakers. Other state names came from English monarchs, French rulers, Spanish words, and even a fictional island from a 16th century novel. As the United States expanded, many names left behind by earlier peoples and governments survived. That means America's map was never named by a single nation at a single point in history. Every name carries traces of the people who lived there first, the explorers who wrote those names down, or the powers that once controlled the land. So how did names older than the United States itself become the official identities of all 50 states? Long before Europeans arrived, North America was already home to hundreds of indigenous nations and communities, each with their own languages, territories, and systems of government. They had names for rivers, lakes, mountains, settlements, and the lands where they lived. Those names were never created for U.S. states, because states did not exist yet. Mississippi, for example, originally referred to the great river running through the region. Alabama came from the name used by an indigenous people in the South, which was later applied to a river and the surrounding territory. Connecticut came from a local indigenous term describing a long tidal river, but many of the words we use today sound very different from their original forms. European explorers often wrote down indigenous words without actually understanding the languages they were hearing. In many cases, they simply spelled the sounds as best they could, and once those names entered European records, they began another transformation. Texas is a good example of what could happen when a local word entered colonial languages. The name traces back to a Caddo word meaning friend or ally. Spanish speakers recorded it in several forms, including Tejas and Texas. When English speakers later became dominant in the region, the spelling Texas remained, while the pronunciation shifted into English. Wisconsin went through an equally complicated transformation. In 1673, French explorer Jacques Marquette traveled along the river there and recorded its local name as Mescusing. But another French explorer, René Robert Cavelier, later misread the handwritten M in Marquette's notes as U, turning the spelling into Wisconsin. By the early 19th century, after the United States had gained independence from Britain, American settlers and officials began adapting the spelling into a more English form. The pronunciation still carried traces of its French and colonial past, and eventually the name became officially established as Wisconsin. Similar layers of linguistic change shaped names such as Michigan, Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas. These names have indigenous roots, but the forms Americans use today often passed through French before being adapted into English. After centuries of that process, some historical records no longer make it clear who originally spoke a word or exactly why its spelling changed. Researchers today can trace the surviving documents and compare different versions, but for some names, there is no way to establish every stage of the transformation with absolute certainty. Meanwhile, other parts of the continent were getting entirely new names from European empires. European colonization introduced another layer of naming across North America. Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands controlled different territories, so the linguistic traces they left behind became concentrated in different regions. English names became especially common along the East Coast. French influence remained strong around major river systems in the interior, while Spanish names spread widely across the South and West. Along the East Coast, the British monarchy left its mark by naming colonies after members of the royal family. Virginia was named after Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. Georgia honored King George II. Carolina comes from the Latin form of the name Charles, while Maryland was closely associated with Queen Henrietta Maria. Early settlers also carried names from Europe into their new settlements. That is how places such as New Hampshire and New Jersey got their names. Some names also record moments of violent conquest. The area we now know as New York was once controlled by the Dutch as part of New Netherland with its main settlement called New Amsterdam. Then, in 1664, an English fleet seized the colony. To signal the new political order, the English renamed the territory New York in honor of James Stuart, the Duke of York. France did something similar farther inland. In 1682, explorer René Robert Cavelier de La Salle claimed a vast river basin for France and named it Louisiana in honor of King Louis XIV. At the time, historical Louisiana covered a much larger territory than the modern state that carries the name today. Spanish influence left a different kind of legacy. Many Spanish names described features of the landscape. Colorado referred to a reddish color. Nevada meant snowy or snow-covered. Montana came from a word associated with mountains. Florida came from Pascua, Florida, a Spanish expression connected to the Easter season and its association with flowers when Spanish sailors first reached the area. And then there is California, whose name may have come from fiction. The strongest historical theory connects it to a popular 16th century Spanish novel about a mythical island ruled by Queen Calafia. Spanish explorers later took the name of that imaginary place and applied it to real land along the western coast of North America. None of these colonial powers ever sat down together and designed a naming system for what would eventually become the United States. Each named places according to its own interests, language, and era. So when the United States later took control of those territories, many of the older names were already deeply established. The United States did not begin with the territory it has today. Its land expanded gradually through wars, treaties, and territorial purchases. And as new regions entered the country, the names already used under previous governments were often carried forward. In 1803, for example, the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory from France. The enormous acquisition covered more than 828,000 square miles and cost $15 million. It effectively doubled the size of the United States at the time. French rule ended, but the name Louisiana survived. Something similar happened after the Mexican-American War. Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, Mexico was forced to surrender roughly 55% of its territory to the United States. Those lands would eventually include states such as California and Nevada, as well as New Mexico. Their Spanish language names remained. By then, many of those names had already appeared in legal documents, property boundaries, and older land records used by local residents. Historically, there was never a single federal rule requiring the United States to preserve every previous place name. In many cases, keeping names that were already widely recognized was simply far easier than rebuilding an entire system of records and administration from scratch. And this expansion took place over generations. Delaware became the first state to join the Union in 1787. Hawaii did not become the 50th state until 1959. That is a span of roughly 172 years, because these territories entered the United States at very different times and under very different political circumstances. Each arrived with its own naming history. But after centuries of passing through different languages and governments, some names became much harder to explain with certainty. Oregon is one of the best-known examples. For years, theories about its name have pointed to Spanish, French, and indigenous languages. Some explanations even connected it to the herb oregano, or to a Spanish expression meaning big ears. More recent historical research has leaned toward an origin somewhere within the Algonquian language family. Even then, the exact sequence of changes that eventually produced the word Oregon remains disputed. The Oregon Encyclopedia itself notes that the details surrounding the name's origin are still debated today. Maine has a similar problem. There is still no single explanation for its name that has gained universal acceptance. Some scholars connect it to the word mainland. Others have linked it to a region in France, while another theory traces it to a place in England. And sometimes historians know where a name came from without knowing what the original word actually meant. Tennessee, for example, can be traced to an old Cherokee settlement called Tanasi. But the original meaning of Tanasi has never been firmly established. Kentucky has the same kind of uncertainty, with several competing theories about both its source language and its original meaning. Part of the problem comes from the way colonial explorers recorded unfamiliar languages. They often wrote down sounds they heard only briefly, without identifying exactly who had spoken the word, which language it belonged to, or what the speaker originally meant. Once those altered spellings survived for generations, they eventually became official names, while parts of their original meanings faded from the historical record. Geo-lovers, the names survived. But a name surviving does not necessarily mean the history of the people who created it survived alongside it. The United States today carries an archive of indigenous languages, European kingdoms, colonial powers, and communities that never planned to build one country together. America came to control the land, but the old names still control the map.